Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to a special edition of the Byline Times podcast, a discussion about the state of modern journalism in the wake of the Bad Press Awards handed out at the Byline Festival, held just below the Westway off Portobello Road in London over the May Bank Holiday weekend. The awards mark some of the worst excesses of our print and broadcast media, exposing those who keep alight the fires of the culture wars, or who otherwise do the bidding of their corporate masters. Nominees included the likes of Piers Morgan, Sarah Vine, Andrew Neil, Richard Littlejohn and Toby Young. After the awards, I brought together some of those involved in the event: BAFTA award-winning actress Joanna Scanlon, Peter York, writer of the official Sloane Ranger Handbook and creator of the Modern Review; Alastair Morgan, long-time campaigner on behalf of his murdered brother Daniel Morgan; compere Jonathan Pye, aka the comedian Tom Walker; and first, Peter Jukes, executive editor of Byline Times. I asked Peter how the awards came about.
Well, I think we needed a fair, press awards are notoriously corrupt. Done for mates, you can't really trust them. So we thought we needed something more unfair, more untrustworthy, and we decided to get our own revenge on the awards that we're never nominated for. So that happened in 2017. Obviously, every year is a kind of rich environment for terrible journalism, sponsored content, misleading headlines and inaccurate articles. And this year, what we had is a raft of new nominees for self-pity, for, a sense of... we're joined by one of the great readers here, Peter York, but I think it was a bumper year, Peter, for certain kinds of bad journalism, particularly around COVID. There was a lot of fake news, sort of fake statistics. We had Toby Young, Alison Pearson, brilliant work in the interest of scientific illiteracy. And then self-pity. We had Piers Morgan crying about being crushed. We had Andrew Neil in tears, read brilliantly by Otto English. And of course, Sarah Vine, read by Jo Scanlon. Her
Brilliantly.
Brilliant.
He omitted the brilliant there, but anyway, it was
brilliantly read. And it was her message to who?
It was a message to her husband, I imagine, in their separation process.
And how they're masters of the universe, but they don't have somebody who really knows what they're really like. Michael.
Yes.
Well, we owe it all to our leaders' brilliant choices of articles, which, when you read them over, and then you read them over again, and then you think, how would I chop this up and give a bit of emphasis, you realise that their writers are barking mad.
It's all so much opinion, standing as news or standing in and taking up space. It's just, there is so little news in it. And that kind of satire, you don't realise how bad the newspapers are until you hear the Bad Press Awards.
When you started reading them out, I mean, those readings were satire, but weren't intentional satire.
No, you don't need to do much to make them sound as if they're a piece of fiction.
Those people actually wrote those things in real newspapers, intending them to be taken literally. That's the amazing stuff. You just have to emphasise a comma, take a few dots along, or, in the case of our brilliant colleague Otto English, do Scottish accents.
He did,
and
yes.
The whole thing becomes evidently as mad as it really is.
It's lovely to take the piss out of them, Peter, but underlying this is quite a serious moment to reflect on how poor so much of the press is.
Yeah, what we do without them, I mean, they're a source of great comedy. The problem is they do run the world. We have Michael Gove was mentioned in the Sarah Vine piece, but other years, Boris Johnson has been a leading contender. We had a great category for government stenographer with an entrance by James Forsyth, who writes for the Spectator, by Harry Cole, friends with the Johnsons, and Alex Wickham, who's allegedly the godfather of their child. And I think just the political media class has got more and more incestuous, hasn't it, Alastair?
Is it his kid? This is what I always ask myself. Is it Johnson's kid? This is what I really often ask myself.
Alex Wickham is not Johnson's kid, by the way. And I must just say, Alastair, I don't think the age works. I oversaw the last few press awards, but this year I was amply helped by a brilliant selector, a guy who goes with a hazmat suit down to the darkest tunnels and disgusting depths of the tabloid press and their ego and pity, and that's Mick Wright, who does the work nobody else dare do and comes out alive, having just found some of the slimiest, most oleaginous pieces of prose you can find.
We're looking at this as if, we're fingering these journalists and asking them to take the rap. But actually, this is a systemic problem. It is not the individual journalists who are responsible for this situation. It is the breakdown of a whole system of news gathering and news dissemination that's the rot. And Peter and I were talking the other day about local news, local newspapers, and the fact we did have a local newspaper tonight. It was cited, the Portsmouth something.
Yes.
Evening News.
Portsmouth Evening News for a bit of sponsored content you wrote that about a psychic.
I didn't write it, but
No,
I read
you read it. So the psychic who was sponsored by Small Business, British Association of Small
Clairvoyant
Business.
lady.
Clairvoyant. What, can you remember the headline?
No, I can't.
A clairvoyant who decides to become a guru when her dead mother visits her in a dream.
In a dream.
Her dead mother called Crystal Clear.
Crystal clear.
This is all true.
But the point is that if you don't have local news, and if you don't have court reporting, and if you don't have the everything coming from the bottom up instead of columnists down, then you don't have a proper democratic check and balance. You just don't.
No, that's brilliant, but it's not very funny. So the way to show it...
You see, we can afford now not to be funny because we've been funny. We've been so funny. We've had the audience rolling amongst the whatever.
AstroTurf.
No, what's Adele's song? Rolling with the...
Rolling in the deep.
Deep. We've had them rolling in the deep. But honestly, there are serious points to be made by the fact that you're examining the process of journalism in the newspapers through these ridiculous columns.
The greatest problem in the modern world is crazed right-wing propaganda. At the moment that it switches to be crazed left-wing propaganda, I will be up in arms against that. But for the moment, it isn't. The dominant thing is right-wing balmy propaganda as espoused by Vladimir Putin or Rupert Murdoch or any of the people we were reading out.
There's a great moment where Jonathan Bai, who was the host on the award, said he was preparing to read a quote, and he said, you have to guess whether this quote came from the Times, the Daily Mail, or the Telegraph. He read it out, we're all scratching our head. Which one is it? The answer, of course, was Vladimir Putin.
At the Byline conference, that's right. And Joe missed a cue there. I think we didn't rehearse that.
I'd completely forgotten. I put my script down at that point because we'd never rehearsed properly. Yes, so that's something we can rectify for next year.
We can rectify it, depending on your availability. You've got to tell your agent you're not subject to any bookings throughout the spring. But it was fascinating, and we have done a lot of work, serious work on this in Byline Times, that the war on woke, he actually talks about J.K. Rowling after the Ukraine invasion, and he talks about J.K. Rowling, like her being cancelled. This rhetoric doesn't just stop at the walls of Fleet Street. We know, thanks to Piers Morgan, a much-cited nominee this year, I think he won his category, that he is spreading his message on the war against woke all around the world. I mean, he's on Australia, he's on Fox Nation, isn't he? This is a global phenomenon, and it goes as far as Russia.
And Alastair, you've faced the corruption of the press directly in trying to get to the bottom of the murder of your brother Daniel. Obviously, we can have great fun about it at the Bad Press Awards, and you joined in the laughter, I know. But as Joanna says, there is a deep systemic problem, which despite Leveson, despite the phone hacking trials, hasn't gone away.
No, it's still the same. I mean, I think the Daily Mail this week has been just off the spectrum, you know.
Well, there's the Keir Starmer party lockdown breaking, and then the Angela Rayner stuff. They're nominees for next year. Didn't actually.
And something this morning that really wound me up is I've forgotten his name, Neil Pawn, just resigned MP.
Neil Parish.
Thank you, Neil Parish. Right, so he was obviously in the papers yesterday as being, he's done a bad thing. This morning, most of the papers that I looked at were saying he's actually a really nice guy and kind of, get off his back. And doesn't everybody watch porn underneath it? As I am absolutely incandescent about that. I think that anybody who is excusing that behaviour, I know he's resigned, but it's a very small thing. It's a normalising process, and this is the Times, this is the Telegraph, this was the Mail. Each one of them saying, he's a nice guy. Actually, it doesn't matter. I'm sure he is a nice guy. What he did is unacceptable, and those papers should have been backing that up.
He was watching it during, allegedly, he's a select committee chair for the Deaf Committee, watching it while selecting the committee. Meanwhile, horrifically, there are 56 MPs under criminal investigation for sexual offences. So you normalise that. What else are you normalising?
It is fascinating that all this should come from newspapers and MPs who would normally be up in arms about pornography as a sign of licence and left-wingery.
It's interesting, on the way down here, I think most people who've looked at Keir Starmer Partygate would recognise that Durham Police have investigated, have decided there is no case to answer. Nevertheless, it is still front page news on papers like the Daily Mail. And the guy on my local station, as I was coming down here from Birmingham, quoted Keir Starmer to me versus Boris Johnson as an example of they're all the same. And it just demonstrates how the papers can throw mud in the eye of the general public and confuse issues deliberately.
Can you imagine any two people not the same as Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson? Keir Starmer actually does come from and of the people. He actually is genuinely working class. And he was named Keir after Keir Harvey because of his progressive working class parents. And he did public service, which his knighthood reflects. Boris Johnson, meanwhile, ...
But I think that's part of this, because Boris Johnson, don't forget, is a journalist, and he is a journalist through and through. He's used these tropes of rhetoric constantly as a form of leadership, so-called leadership and government. And that if we don't take this opportunity to scrutinise journalistic malpractice, then we're not allowing people to see the tools that are utilised currently by our Prime Minister.
I think Alastair come here because he's seen, the way that a really serious story is disparaged, minimised. His own brother was, in the first Crime Watch about Daniel's murder, was portrayed as some sort of lurid peeping Tom.
Yeah, I don't really like to remember that, but I mean, that was the BBC. That's the BBC.
An example of it. And what they do, you see, is like Vladimir Putin, he pumps both sides extreme. So extreme Black Lives Matter groups, gun groups. So we, in the end, we tune out. We go, it's Joe said, or you said, don't trust any of them. That guy you met on the tube, but don't trust any of them. Who does that suit, that cynicism? The people behind the scenes. The people who don't believe in democracy, don't believe you should vote for anybody, newspaper proprietors and oligarchs. Because if we all back off, they win.
I was interested when you talked about it being a structural issue, Joanna. What did you mean by that?
I mean, it is partly about... It's two things, I think. One is money, how much money there is available for newspapers to write content, the kinds of wages and salaries that very young journalists can not find because there's almost nothing to live off, freelancing, too much freelancing, losing the huge, vast swathes of reporters which are required if you want to get into these stories. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is technology and the breakdown of the platforms and the means by which the newspapers are telling the story and their competition within social media. And those two things, unholy alliance have come together to create a situation in which I don't believe we are safe as democratic nations.
It's interesting, a few years ago people were talking about the demise of dead tree media, the old print media, the traditional newspapers. If anything, I would suggest, for the reasons that you've highlighted, they've strengthened their hands in recent years. They are the organs with the most money and the most power, and they can effectively tell young journalists, this is what you write, and if you don't write like this, you won't have a job.
No, and podcasts have become places where you can find a bit more punch, you can find a bit more passion, and perhaps I don't really like to use the word truth, but something closer to a truth of what is actually going on, and not just opinion that is, as you say, often just down the barrel from the proprietor.
Dead tree media are important because their people and their ideas get replicated. They get pushed into Parliament, and they get pushed out on social media, and they get pushed out on mainstream broadcast media. So you get BBC and ITV News and full of dead tree media commentators. So if you're lucky enough as a non-dom to own a dead tree medium, you can be sure that your people will be out there on Newsnight and Good Morning Britain saying your story.
Well, it's one of the ironies, isn't it, that we talk about dead tree media. That's the only thing that's dead about it, because if you look at what the papers say, as opposed to the Byline Times, what the papers don't say, what the papers say still dictates the news agenda, still dictates the agenda of what's discussed on national radio, on local radio.
Even more so, I think, now. Oh, we're joined by Tom Walker,
AKA Jonathan Pye.
AKA Jonathan Pye. We're just talking about, Adrian's doing our podcast for us, about the dead tree media.
I was literally coming over to just say, hi, guys. Now I'm in the middle of an interview. But yes, sorry, carry on.
Okay, well, are you extra for this? No. There was a panel today from Brian Cathcart, I think Hardeep, our editor, chaired it with Peter Oborne. And they have converged, the political and media class. Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, both journalists. The dead tree media needed a convenient government power not to follow through anything Leveson. Look at Leveson 2, which would have unveiled the Daniel Morgan murder and the role of the press in working with the murder suspects. So uniquely in this country, we have a punditocracy. And they know, and what Brian Cathcart said, every little policy review, policy whatever it's done thing about prevent, they've got them in the paper. There's Douglas Murray's book, The Time to Come Out With It. It's a convergence of a class, and it is about class, because you can know, and Joe pointed this about how poorly journalists are paid. The only way you get to go into journalism now, if you've got a rich parent who owns property in London.
Only way to be an actor as well, don't forget.
I was about to say, I mean, in every industry, it's that. I mean, you can afford to fail, can't you, if you're privately educated and you've got a lot of money, and journalism is that. I see it with actors, and no offence to these wonderful actors that were all Eton trained, because you can afford to be out of work for 10 years. It's a bit more difficult when you're, not that.
Bring back Margaret Thatcher's enterprise allowance scheme.
Yeah. Well, we were students together. Do you remember, Joe and I were students together, and we did drama together. Housing allowance. I got a full maintenance grant because we earned so little. I was one-parent family at that point. And we got housing benefits. You remember in the summer? That used to keep us going in Edinburgh.
It seems indulgent to go into this, but at that time, you could, even when we were students, we had the dole in the summer holidays, which is incredible. I was on a full grant too because my parents had no money, and then we joined into the enterprise allowance scheme to give us a training for 10 years. I mean, it was extraordinary.
I was the last year where fees were paid and you had a maintenance grant, and it was a given. I mean, I couldn't afford to go to a posh drama school because, well, I couldn't be asked to try and get a scholarship, but I wouldn't have been able to go. I wouldn't be able to afford to go to university if I was now. And it's not like I'm from a desperately poor background, but I'm certainly not from a wealthy background. It would have been far too much of a risk for me to go to drama school.
There are so many protocols within journalism that you have to be trained for. You can't.
Right, yes.
You don't just get born a journalist. There's a lot of rules, regulations, ethics, processes, methods that you need to find. I mean,
there should be.
Well, there isn't anymore.
Yes.
But if you joined a paper, as most of the big dead tree guys did when they were 16 and learnt that way, then they had a proper training. I believe in training, I believe in education, and I believe you should be paid during that process. I can't believe that we have become a country of internships.
So, and that's for the rich. So the guy, you can hear some music in the background, the Samba band, all the music on the Byline Festival has really been organised by Chris Sullivan, right? He founded the WAG Club. He arrived in central London from Merthyr Tydfil. He lived in central London, started the WAG Club, left school at 16. How could he do that now? Who can live in central London? Who could found a club? And so our culture is diminished. I think, I'm being pretentious now, but Walter Benjamin, the great German philosopher, effectively killed by the Nazis, said all the great arts appear at the margins. So Shakespeare was where there was bear baiting and cinema and peep shows. All the great, look at the Beatles. All the great stuff we create has been really, occasionally from a great central artist like Mozart or something. That's not us, obviously. But, it comes from people coming up to society, and we're stifling that.
Joanna, you have a particular problem amongst all of us here in that some of the work that you do relies on, or at least hopes for, commendation by some of the people that you're criticising. Are you worried about that?
Well, I haven't slagged off any critics as such, but not really. I think you take it, as it comes, and I think that criticism is slightly aside from news journalism. It's always been a slightly different arena. I mean, I don't know any critics bar one. I do know one critic, and I think you're not hand in glove as an actor with that critic. And if they all decide to say, because I think that there's something systemically rotten in the processes of, journalistic practice currently, if they all decide they're going to give me no stars, fine by me.
I suppose the fear is, though, that it will be the non-critics, the news journalists who might somehow hone in on Joanna Scanlon and decide that you are
Please don't encourage them.
an enemy of the state.
Please don't make the suggestion.
But aren't they two separate... I mean, you're looking at art, for want of a better word, and journalism, which can have its sort of, so one imagines, although if you read a bad critique of your work, it hurts, but it's not your peers. Do you know there is that separation? It's just a hack journalist having a go at you. If it was one of your actual peers having a go at you, that would sort of hurt much more, presumably.
No, and the democracy is a more important subject for me than arts journalism, or even the arts. I know the arts and soft power culture is very, 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 very important and informs a huge amount of the debates and influences in itself, but it's not the same as actually having a threat to democratic process.
Which is where you think we're at in this country now?
I think we're seriously under democratic process is under threat without a very strong journalistic set of ethics and processes.
I spent years and years and years, decades, being a modish airhead. It was lovely.
A modish
airhead. It was absolutely lovely, and I long to go back to it. However, the fierce urgency of now, the fact that, for instance, our public service broadcasting structure is totally under threat from a rather Hungarian government, an Orban-like government, who wants to get rid of the BBC as it currently is, and who wants to privatise Channel 4, diverts you somewhat. I pray for the day when I can get back to being a modish airhead.
So that will be our test. You're like the canary in the mine. When you become a modish airhead again, we're safe.
Yeah.
Of the readings tonight, of the articles that you read, because for people who weren't here, you were reading articles that had been nominated for the Bad Press Awards. Which was your favourite / least favourite, Joanna?
Oh, I can't. There isn't a least favourite. No,
as in,
there's
the worst.
There's a point by which it doesn't fall.
Yeah.
No, I think of the ones I read, I really enjoyed Alison Pearson. She is I mean, she's actually a good writer. I mean, she uses words well. And
for people who weren't here, just tell us about Alison's piece.
Oh, Alison was talking, as you may or may not know, but Alison has been strongly objected to the government's response to the scientists in the ways that they have dictated how we get through COVID, masks and lockdowns and everything else. So she's objected to that from the beginning, from the point of view, I think, principally of what she would call freedom and freedom of choice. But she ends her piece, which is her Christmas message, she calls it a Christmas message ? And she ends it by saying that we are now approaching the existential crisis, humans versus scientists, which is a great line. And she does use words really well, and actually is a really nice way to it's a nice piece to perform. But I think that's not always the point, and some of the not so good wordsmiths were probably making more, as selected, were making better points than
There
hers.
is something quite chilling, isn't there, about a prominent newspaper journalist talking about scientists in such a derogatory way. Scientists, people who are trained and know what they're talking about.
It's actually nonsensical, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't bear scrutiny. Come on.
That's the problem with great style, Joe. I mean, we were at university together, students, and there's always elevated. You did history, I did literature. Great style, and by the end, I became so suspicious of that. Somebody made a point once, I think it was that, our government, apart from being led by pundits, a lot from the Spectator, who elevates style. If you write something beautifully, it doesn't matter if you're a bloody fascist. And actually, what I hate about that style, if you listen to what they said, there was nothing there. It was just style.
Yeah, but isn't that most papers these days? Back in the day, you used to have a newspaper and an opinion column down the side. It's just the whole thing's an opinion column now.
Cheaper.
And it's cheaper, it's easier, it's sort of more exciting because some of those things that I heard tonight, you kind of go, they must, as they're writing it, think, oh, fuck it. I'll see how far I can... Oh, fuck it. You just like... My favourite bit is Andrew Neil, the bit about Andrew Neil when he's talking about woe is me, and clearly he's made a terrible career move, and he knew that after 10 seconds of GB News.
And this was his sort of GB News.
This was him going, and I was in tears, and my career was over, and my wife discussed it, and blah, 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 and we decided to get on a private jet, drink some champagne, and go to Jersey to sort it all out. And you go, do you know what, mate? You're all right, aren't you? You're going to be fine.
I wish he'd written it himself, because it was an interview, and he was saying, he was confiding in the interviewer, and I just wish he'd written his own piece saying the same things, because I would have loved to have heard it from the man himself.
It's when she says, and he, with a tear in his eyes, as I was hugging him. It's just, that was my favourite, I think.
There's a great thing in the American right wing to say that fact-checking, like science, is an extravagant metropolitan liberal elite idea, and it's spreading here. Fact-checking, so these people say, is a very, very bad idea. We should not have facts.
So basically what fact-checking is, double-checking someone isn't lying, isn't it? And you're saying that's a terrible... Yes, they say that's a terrible idea.
But there is no such thing as a fact. There's no such thing as a truth behind a fact. There is no... this is where the whole very centre of conversation, let alone newspapers...
Stop cancelling me with facts. And that's what basically people don't contradict me, because if you're challenged by facts... Now, this microphone we're talking to doesn't work without facts, without science and technology. The GPS satellites need Einstein in physics, heart surgery.
I said it in the opening, the hilarious opening monologue that I did. But the idea that
did you write that?
That we give the news gives fact and opinion the same weight, so that we kind of can't see one from the other. So the news these days goes, here's a fact. Now let's see what the person on the street thinks. As if that is as valid. Well, I don't want to wear a face mask. As if that's as valid as a scientist going, it will help. You can still go, I don't want to wear a face mask. That's fine, and it's a valid or invalid opinion. But the idea that the news gives them the same weight, that's again, it's editorialized. It's the opinion column. That's what news is now.
And we like to think, don't we, in our very exceptional British way, that we are somehow superior to the Americans and to Fox News.
Well, we are.
But this is a version of Fox News, isn't it? What Fox News represents, a dilution of that, is endemic in our media now, in our print media and perhaps in our broadcast media as well.
Without a doubt. I mean, the difference between, or it used to be the case, the difference between American and British news media would be that our TV is very central, let's hear both sides kind of thing, and it's our print media that is rabidly right or left, and it used to be the opposite in America. Actually, their print media was fairly more even-handed, and it was always Fox News or going one way or the other. But I think that's sort of leveled off now, and it's all just a quagmire of shite, really, across the board.
I remember when Peter and I were students, and the post-structuralism debate was raging at King's College, and what's his name was resigned or was sacked.
Colin
McCabe was sacked or resigned or whatever. And I, as Peter said, I didn't do English. I was doing history, and I said, "What is this? What is this post-structuralism? What is it?" And you said to me something like, "Well, it's where there isn't anything real, there is no truth, and all you have are these forms or, signs by which people derive through perceptions their end conclusion." And that academic notion, that philosophical notion, which I think is jolly interesting, still do, but is being hijacked by an agenda. I really believe it's been hijacked by an agenda to say multiplicity equals zero, equals nothing.
So you've lost me slightly because I'm not as well educated as you. But are we talking about? But are we talking about the phenomenon of sort of the individual here? Is that what you're talking about? In the sense that we all have our
own subjective truth.
Yes, and those subjective truths must be respected at all costs, even if you're clearly, blatantly.
So was a left-wing thing? Just the background was the left-wing thing to say like science is on. It's the canon, the literary canon, was dead white men, right? So
yes.
Enlightenment was dead white men, which it was, but it was still the Enlightenment. I still believe in it,
yes,
right? And said, well, what about these other truths? It was a left-wing thing, as Peter. Look, the man most to blame for this is standing on my right, because Peter York started the Modern Review. What was the Modern Review? It was post-structuralism, Peter. It was Julie Burchill and Toby Young. You started them off.
It's my fault.
But the idea
is that truth is subjective, that there's no absolute truth, and the right took that over. And actually, a lot of those figures which seemed left-wing, like Julie Burchill and Toby Young and Tony Parsons, went to the right. And all I'd say is, on that, of course, you don't get absolute truth. The whole idea is structuralism, the sign and the signifier aren't the same thing. Very, very boring. But you never get to the pole star. You can still tell where north is. You use the idea that you never have absolute truth, but you use the idea that you're going to get more truthful to navigate, until Peter York came along, this modish person, and destroyed culture. How are you going to explain yourself?
I did it single-handed.
And I did it on purpose.
Look, I regret it so deeply, particularly the amount of money lost in the process.
But is that intellectual moment that Joanna and Peter described, is that a fair description of the Modern Review, do you think?
Look, the Modern Review was very, very funny at a point in time when you could have that sort of fun. Huh? And now, you wouldn't.
Can I challenge Jonathan, Tom? Tom is this lovely guy, Jonathan.
That's what you always call me, Jonathan Tom.
Yeah, because there's this lovely guy called Tom, and then this quite scary guy called Jonathan. But I think humour's to blame. Now, Joe and I always have this humour.
Yes.
I blame Private Eye for some of this. I remember the argument. Joe was always going to swan off the fucking foot. Can I swear? The fucking footlights. So I was going to do serious plays. Let's do JM Sing. Let's do something I'm going to write. Because
You didn't. I'm sorry. Just to set the record straight here, it's not because of anything Peter said that I was interested in straight drama or plays. That was my background.
I know.
Anyway, yes.
Anyway, but we were contemporaries. They were old enough. Stephen Fry, Emma Thompson, obviously became a serious actor. Hugh Laurie became a serious actor. Tony Slattery struggled with mental health. And I think that what happened in British culture was that. And it's always the problem with English. When I was travelling abroad, oh, you're English, you're naturally funny. Americans would think, Monty Python, you're funny, and you just say something, they'd laugh. Humour became, and the Russians definitely use irony, but that enabled Boris Johnson. He's funny, so it doesn't matter if he's a lying son of a bitch. It doesn't matter that he breaks all these personal vows for him. He's fun on Have I Got News For You. You know he's nominated for a BAFTA, Joe. I'm just saying that's slightly undermining your BAFTA.
Who was nominated for a BAFTA?
Boris Johnson.
What, for being on Have I Got News For You?
For being the presenter, taking over from Angus Deaton when Angus Deaton had been
destroyed by Piers Morgan. There's a brilliant show. You should watch Piers Morgan on the show with Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton, obviously, he's reading a script. Tears him to shreds. So it's funny. And there's a look in Piers Morgan. I'm going to
kill you. Yeah.
And he does.
Yeah.
So I think humour is part of our problem.
Well, it's one of the tools it's one of the rhetorical tools and one of the seductive tools by which you can sugar the pill.
Well, if you're funny, you normally, by virtue of that, have some form of charisma. And I think that's, I hate to say it, but Boris does have a charisma. It's fascinating.
It's great. It's great to have some comments.
And one imagines in his company, you sort of go, oh, what an amusing sort of chap. But unfortunately, that's...
But if he hadn't been so hungry for power and money, he would have made a brilliant backbencher. Because that is the kind of person you want on the backbenches. Yeah. That is the kind of cut through who's slicing through government's agendas. Yeah. That is exactly what you want. But he doesn't deploy, big noise in the background. He doesn't deploy his skills and his charisma to that intent.
But what are his skills? Because, I mean, he does have charisma.
He has no skills.
I can't think of any...
He has no.
Well, I think he has some comic timing.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. So from the charisma end, he's got skills, but politically...
I don't mean beyond that. I mean his performance skills and his performative
but also
identity.
The higher he's gone, the more that doesn't work anymore, because you're suddenly you're doing a briefing about a global pandemic, and you just no. I actually need words now. I need words, and I need direction, and I want to know that you're in a little bit of Latin, and it doesn't cut it anymore, you know? I mean, I found him a figure of fun for years. I couldn't believe it when London elected him mayor twice. I found that extraordinary, but, well, I guess the mayor is a figurehead that's kind of just okay, well, there's a bit of personality going out there. I mean, I never really understood it, but he's supposed to be a serious politician now, and he's still this bumbling... sort of idiot.
I think you're right about... I think Peter's right about comedy.
He's also right about
Peter's also right about the kind of value of entertainment and lightness and so on. And Tom, you're right completely about the fact that we don't have the capacity to be interested in facts, and we want this entertainment value. And the whole... I mean, I myself completely hands up. I am no longer as able to concentrate and read and absorb information as I was. It might be partly aging, but it's also something else. It's like my brain has been rotted somehow, and my concentration skills are no longer there. If you sat me down in front of a newspaper of 1976 and I had to read it in the way I would have read it in 1976, I'm not sure I'd stay with it. Everything's so sensationalized and sexualized and made into kind of exciting puppy.
I sometimes feel that I've read the papers, and I haven't. I've gone through Instagram and seen the front pages, and I know what the headlines are. And sometimes I kid myself that I've read the papers. I watched an episode a few years back of Bullseye from 1982 on Challenge, and the questions were intelligent, intellectual. It was about this, it was about literature, it was like these working class dartsmen, and they knew their stuff. You know what I mean? You go and you watch a quiz today and it's sort of A, B or C. And I mean, we're all sort of just dumbed down.
It's a plot, obviously. But I can tell you, without fear of contraception, that I had a dance-off with Boris Johnson just to Otis Redding, just over there, literally, just down there.
Well, who won? At 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Who is to know? It was rather late.
Boris can't dance. You can dance. And that's what
it's too modest to say.
No, I must say, when we have this nostalgia for this intelligent time of the past, I'm old enough to remember the 70s. These are all too young. Joe can barely remember that Peter was a style guru during that time. He was having, in the 90s, dance-offs with Boris Johnson. It wasn't any better then. Obviously, our brains are wired, but actually we're more conscious of how bad it is. That's an improvement.
Well, yes, you're always, I mean, I don't want to be an old fogey, and I am, but there we are. And looking back, and wasn't it always better then? I mean, that is a hopeless position, and I want to challenge myself. But I do think you have to remember that, you know, Goebbels gave every person in the nation a free radio so that he could play out his Grand Prix to show the brilliance of Mercedes-Benz and and the other companies that he had created, to give this impression to the nation of the great German supremacy. And it was through the technology of this propagandist tool, the radio, as it was. I mean, we're on radio now, but it's still a powerful medium, and that is this propaganda for an agenda is often very hard to locate. We think we find it, we think we're doing it, we think we've got it nailed with the Bad Press Awards, but maybe we haven't. Maybe it's somewhere else and we can't yet see it.
Joanna Scanlon. And if you've never been to the Byline Festival, and I hadn't until this year, I really would recommend that you do so. It's intelligent, thought-provoking, and occasionally, as you can hear, raucous fun. I'm Adrian Goldberg, and you've been listening to the Byline Times podcast. If you want to support journalism that reports without fear or favour, please take out a subscription to the Byline Times, our brilliant monthly paper. Your subs pays for this podcast, Byline Radio, Byline TV, and our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's where you'll find details of how to subscribe at bylinetimes.com. Thanks very much indeed for listening. I'll see you next time.